Okay, good morning. Module 2 is about managing cash, receivables, and inventory. And this is divided into three topics. So one is the working capital management, the other one is the operating cycle, and last one is the cash conversion cycle. Now let's discuss the working capital management. What is working capital and why is this important in the company? So, working capital in accounting refers to the excess of the current assets over current liabilities, which is expressed as working capital is equal to current assets minus current liabilities. Working capital has no universal standard definition. So, this is equated directly with cash items. Okay, which is the general and common understanding of the concepts. So, pag sinabi nating working capital, of course, we need the assets. And then, what type of assets? Current assets, which is the cash or the cash items. And this is important in the business because it represents the operating activities of the business. Then the inflow and outflows of the cash needed to fund the operations. And this is considered a lifeblood of the business. While working capital management is the administration and control of the company's working capital. Okay, so yung nagkocontrol po sa working capital ng company is the management or the administration. Yun po yung tinatawag na working capital management. The primary objective is to achieve a balance between profitability and then the risk. Okay, kaya po may assigned persons or personals po sa working capital management. Kasi gusto nilang ma-achieve yung pinaka-objective ng company, which is the balance between profitability and then the risk. So basically, there are three types of working capital financing policies the management can choose from. So tatlo po yung pwedeng pagpilian po ng management when it comes to capital financing policy. So these are the maturity matching capital financing policy, aggressive working capital financing policy, and conservative working capital financing policy. Now let's discuss the maturity matching capital financing policies. So in maturity matching capital financing policies, the permanent working capital requirements should be financed by long-term sources. And then the temporary working capital requirements should be financed by a short-term sources of financing. So kung ang gagamitin po is the permanent working capital, yung sa maturity, okay, yung match po niyan, okay, is a long-term sources, financed by long-term sources. Kung temporary working capital naman po yung maturity na gagamitin, yan po ay imamatch sa financing by short-term sources. Okay? Next is the aggressive working capital financing policies. So under the aggressive working capital financing policies, some of the permanent working capital requirements are financed by short-term sources of financing. Some lang. Kasi kaya po yan tinawag na aggressive working capital financing. So, kung titignan niyo po dun sa maturity match, okay, working capital financing, yung permanent working capital requirements ay kailangang i-finance ng long-term sources. In aggressive, since this is aggressive working capital financing policies, some of the permanent working capital requirements are financed by short-term sources of financing. Here, most of the resources of the business are tied up in non-current assets and requires only a small amount of cash, receivables, and inventory. So, mapapansin niyo po sa aggressive working capital financing policy, since pwedeng niyo pong i-finance yan ng short-term sources of financing lang, okay, ang ginagawa po, yung most of the resources ng business, okay, ita-tied up sa non-current assets. Example, yung resources po ng business is the cash. Yung cash na yun, ita-tied up yun sa non-current assets, like fixed assets. Okay? So, pagka ganoon, nangangailangan lang yun ng small amount of cash, receivables, and inventory. Okay, another example, let's say, sources po ng business is the inventories. Okay? Yung inventories ng business, yun po yung gagamitin as working capital, okay, ng business. Ita-tied up yun sa non-current assets. Let's say, for example, machine or machinery. Pagpa-partnerin yung dalawa, okay, as working capital financing. Okay, doon, nangangailangan lang yun ng small amount of cash or receivables and then inventory. So again, pag aggressive po yung ating permanent working capital requirements, pwede pong i-finance by short-term sources of financing. The next one is conservative working capital financing policies. Based on this, even some of the temporary working capital requirements are financed by long-term sources of financing. Yun naman po yung conservative. High investment in the current assets is considered conservative. Here, the business has substantial amount of cash, receivables, and inventories. So, kung mapapansin nyo po sa maturity and matching working capital, pag permanent working capital, yung ginamit, yung requirements po, dapat yun ay i-finance ng long-term sources. Pag temporary working capital requirements naman should be financed by a short-term sources of financing. Pagdating po sa aggressive working capital financing policy, some of the permanent working capital requirements, okay, are financed by short-term sources of financing. Yung ibang permanent working capital requirements po ay pwedeng i-finance ng short-term resources, okay, of financing. So, sa aggressive working capital financing policies, yung most of the resources of the business are tied up, okay, in non-current assets. So, pagpapartnerin po yung current assets and then the non-current assets para gamitin as aggressive working capital financing ng business. So, dito, nangangailangan lang po ng small amount of cash, receivables, and inventories. Pagdating naman sa conservative working capital financing policy, yung temporary working capital requirements po ay pwedeng i-finance by long-term sources of financing. So, ang kinukonsider po sa conservative working capital financing policy is the high investment in the current assets. Here, the business has substantial amount of cash, receivables, and inventories. So, I am giving you an examples. So, ano pong examples yon? Let's say, company needs 10 million in working capital to support an annual sales of 50 million. So, yung company po, meron pong annual sales na 50 million. Okay? And then, meron nangangailangan po, or the company needs 10 million in working capital to support the annual sales. So, kung meron po tayong 50 million annual sales, kailangan po natin ng working capital na 10 million para ma-support natin yung annual sales na 50 million. Okay? If the sales increase to 100 million, will the 10 million working capital be enough? Okay, most likely the answer is no. Okay? Kung yung sales po natin ay nag-increase sa 100 million, yung 10 million po na working capital ay hindi po enough para ma-support po yung annual sales na 1 million. Because with 100 million sales, there will be more cash needed for the operation, more accounts receivable, and if the company is trading or manufacturing company. Kung mataas po yung ating annual sales, hindi po kakayanin yung 10 million po as working capital para ma-support po natin yung 10 million sales. Kasi dito, kailangan po natin ng mas malaking cash, okay, for the operation. Expect din na marami pong accounts receivables na papasok. Let's say, naibenta mo yung product mo pero on credit naman, pwede pong mangyari yun. Lalo na kung ang company po ay trading or manufacturing company. So, pagkano kaya yung kailangan nating working capital para ma-support natin yung 100 million? Siguro pwede na yung 20 million working capital. Kasi dun sa example ko, yung 10 million working capital, kaya niyang i-support yung annual sales na 50 million. So, kung 100 million sales po yan, siguro yung 20 million is enough as working capital to support the annual sales of 100 million. Okay? Let us proceed to the difference between permanent working capital and temporary working capital. Kasi nababanggit yan dun sa unang slides. Okay, so when we say permanent working capital, it refers to the level of current assets, which is to be maintained and vital for the firm to carry its business regardless of the operation levels. Again, level of current assets, which is to be maintained. So, yung mga current assets na gagamitin natin as working capital, dapat po ma-maintain. Okay, kaya po yung tinawag na permanent working capital. Okay, when we say temporary working capital, it refers to the working capital which is over and above the permanent working capital. So, from the name itself, temporary, so, maaaring magra-run yan for yung ating business ng 1 year, okay, or more than a year. Okay, so another differences of permanent and temporary working capital. So permanent working capital is also known as fixed or hard working capital, while temporary working capital is known as fluctuating or variable or seasonal working capital. Again po, yung permanent working capital, ano po yan? Fixed working capital. That's why kailangan mo nga pong i-maintain yung working capital po in a certain business. While temporary working capital, this is a fluctuating. When you say fluctuating, pwede siyang bumaba. Okay. Variable or pwede naman pong seasonal working capital. So, permanent capital does not depend upon any factors, while temporary working capital depends upon several factors as it is keep on fluctuating from period to period. Since permanent ngayon, capital, hindi talaga nakadepende yun sa mga factors na pwedeng maging cause ng closure, okay, ng isang business. Pero po sa temporary working capital, since fluctuating, okay, from period to period. Okay, nakadepend po yun sa mga factors para po as it keep on fluctuating from period to period. Okay. And then permanent working capital is stable while temporary working capital is fluctuating. Sabi natin fluctuating, pwede pong mag-increase, sometimes decreases. So again, yung permanent working capital, stable po yun. Pero yung temporary working capital po, fluctuating. Pwedeng mag-increase ngayon, pwedeng mag-decrease bukas, or pwedeng yung sales mo ngayon ay mataas, yung sales mo bukas mababa. Tandaan po, kapag ang sales natin ay mataas, okay, nangangailangan po yun ng, syempre mataas din na working capitals. Okay? Next, there are more such differences between these working capitals. So we have the best team of experts who are experienced in writing for years. We also clear explanation to this by using diagrams and figures like the level of the working capital in case of stable firm and in case of a growing firm.